The first time Dalton Wart saw the old gates, he thought the snow was playing tricks on him. The storm had thickened into a white curtain, so heavy and intentional it felt like nature was trying to erase the road behind him. He'd been trudging alone for hours ever since the man at the gas station refused to let him inside. Maybe it was the look in Dalton's eyes. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, half tired, half haunted. People always sensed something off about him. The gates yawned open like a mouth mid-breath. At first, Dalton didn't register how strange that was. The ironwork was delicate and ancient, the kind of handcrafted metal no one made anymore. Beyond them, a long drive twisted through skeletal trees, their bare branches curling like exposed nerves. He stepped through without thinking. His boots were drenched, his toes numb, and the cold had seeped so deep into his bones that it made the world feel unreal. 6 weeks earlier, when he'd walked away from the Rhode Island Correctional Facility, he told himself he had a plan. Denver, maybe Portland, someplace far enough and crowded enough for a man like him to disappear. But plans demand money, and money demands luck, and Dalton's luck had always run in reverse. Through the storm, the house slowly revealed itself. A massive Victorian giant, carved with layers of ornate trim and towers that pierced the white sky. It was the kind of mansion people restored into tourist retreats, but this one stood untouched, as if frozen in the century that birthed it. Light glowed in several windows, warm and steady, defying the storm outside. The sight of it made something old and fragile stir in Dalton's chest. A memory of warmth, maybe, of belonging, of the years when his mother cleaned rich homes and occasionally let him wait inside the kitchen while she worked. Instinct guided him to the side door the kind servants used. It was locked, but the wood frame was swollen and tired. 2 hard kicks were enough. The wind swallowed the crack of breaking wood, leaving the house silent as if it had been expecting him. Heat wrapped around him the moment he stepped inside. He stood in a narrow mudroom dripping meltwater, his breath turning to steam. Beyond it, the kitchen glowed with a practiced elegance, copper pots polished to mirror brightness, an island of smooth butcher block, a stove built for someone who took food seriously. Even the refrigerator hummed with a confident, expensive quiet. "Hello," Dalton called out. His voice sounded scraped out, like it hadn't been used in years. The warmth, the lights, the open gates, everything felt wrong in a way he couldn't yet name. But for the first time in a long while, he wasn't out in the cold. Then he meant it too. Anybody here? Nothing answered him. No footsteps shifting overhead, no faint rustle from a distant hallway, not even the groan of an old house adjusting to winter's weight. It was as if the walls themselves were waiting for something. He stepped from the kitchen into a long dining room. A grand table stretched the length of the floor, polished so perfectly it reflected the chandelier glowing above it. The cabinet in the corner held crystal so clear it shimmered like frozen water. The overhead light had been left on, shining as though someone had just stepped out for a moment, yet everything was untouched. A corridor led toward the front of the house, framed by portraits of stern faces and powdered collars. Their painted eyes followed him with that familiar aristocratic judgment, the unspoken question of who he was and why he dared to exist in their space. He pushed onward until a parlor opened to his left, and that was where he froze. It was a room preserved in time, a Persian rug softened by decades of footsteps, velvet chairs deep enough to swallow a person whole, shelves of old books that smelled of dust and long quiet conversations. A fireplace sat ready to ignite, logs arranged with mathematical care. But none of that mattered. because in the far corner, angled toward the center of the room as if it had been waiting for an audience, sat a clown. Dalton stood rooted in place. His mind, heavy with cold and exhaustion, begged him to reinterpret what he was seeing as statue, a forgotten decoration, anything else. But the figure was unmistakable, life-size, maybe a full 6 feet if it were standing. Its suit was a riot of purple and yellow stripes, fabric sagging like tired skin. A frilled collar drooped around its neck, stained the color of old paper. Enormous curled shoes pointed outward as if mid-step. And the face. The head looked molded, handcrafted from some brittle material. Thick white paint covered every inch of it, uneven and rough. Red circles blotted its cheeks, and a grotesquely wide smile split across its mouth, the lips swollen and unnatural. Blue diamonds framed the eyes that shouldn't have looked real, but somehow glimmered as though reflecting actual light. They were painted, or so he insisted. They had to be painted, but the shine made him question it, made his skin crawl. Forcing himself forward, he crossed the room with trembling hands. It's just cold, he told himself. Just the cold making you shake like that. He crouched by the fireplace, found a box of matches waiting neatly on the mantel, and lit the logs. The fire flared to life, warm air rising like a sigh of relief from the room itself. He didn't look at the corner again, but he felt it, that silent watcher behind him. Mannequins always looked like they were following him. He knew that. Perspective tricks. Human brains searching for patterns where none existed. And he'd seen enough unsettling places in his life to understand how quickly exhaustion and fear could warp perception. Just a prop, he muttered. But the warmth from the fire did little to settle the uneasy prickle along his spine. Trying to distract himself, he headed back to the kitchen and pulled the refrigerator open. To his surprise, it was stocked. Fresh milk, eggs, a dish tucked beneath a glass lid, like someone had set aside dinner for a guest who never arrived. The house wasn't abandoned. Someone lived here. And if they were still around, they were letting him wander their home completely unnoticed. The moment he lifted the lid, a homemade casserole, still carrying a faint warmth as if it had been cooked earlier that very day. On the counter, he found a loaf tucked neatly inside a ceramic bread keeper, and a butter dish shaped like a cow grinning at him with glassy little eyes. He assembled 3 sandwiches in silence, fighting the primal urge to devour everything in sight. He forced himself to chew, slow and disciplined, even as his body screamed to inhale the food until he couldn't breathe. When he finally stopped, his stomach felt painfully full but grounded, human again. Back in the parlor, the fire's glow had softened the icy ache inside him. His hands no longer trembled. He sank into a deep, burgundy armchair angled perfectly between the doorway, the fire, and the clown. He didn't trust the idea of turning his back on it. Minutes slipped by like melting snow, time bending between warmth and exhaustion. Every few seconds his eyes drifted shut, only for his body to jolt awake, convinced he'd heard a soft tread on the stairs, a whisper of fabric, a breath not his own. But each time he listened, there was nothing. Only the wood crackling in the fireplace, the storm clawing at the windows, and the faint groans of an old house settling deeper into winter. The clown sat exactly as before, tilted head, painted smile, eyes fixed somewhere over his shoulder as if watching a ghost above him. Dalton pushed himself back onto his feet. He moved around the figure in a slow orbit, studying it from every angle. Up close, the detail was unnerving. The silk costume drooped with age but showed not a single tear. The massive shoes were cracked at the seams like real leather. White cotton gloves rested on its knees in a strangely casual posture, almost rehearsed. But the paint wasn't layered on cheap material the way he'd assumed. Beneath the white surface, he could see something else. A grain, a texture, not the flat smoothness of papier-mâché, but the subtle patterns of skin. Tiny indentations that mimicked pores, a faint shadow where stubble should be, a thin blue line along the temple that looked disturbingly like a vein beneath silicone. Expensive, meticulously crafted, the sort of grotesque luxury a wealthy eccentric might purchase just to unsettle guests at a dinner party. He'd heard about such things during his time doing repairs at Providence House. An ex-surgeon on the third floor kept lifelike medical mannequins in his apartment, anatomically detailed, uncomfortably realistic. People with money found the strangest hobbies. Dalton returned to the chair, trying to shake off the unease crawling under his skin. The fire was dying down, so he added another log and watched the sparks scatter upward like tiny fireflies caught in a draft. When he turned back toward the corner, his heart lurched violently into his throat. The clown's head was angled the other way. No slow settling of material, no trick of the light, no imagination born from fatigue. It had moved. For a long, suffocating stretch, 3 seconds, maybe 4, Dalton couldn't breathe. His body refused to obey him. The painted eyes were pointed directly at him now, unblinking. The smile was unchanged. The hands hadn't shifted. But the head had. And he knew with a cold certainty he'd stake his life on this. It was looking at him. It couldn't have moved. That's what Dalton whispered to himself, gripping the back of the chair like it was the only thing anchoring him to the world. He'd been staring at the fire, not the clown. His eyes were heavy, his memory scrambled. Exhaustion twisted perception in ways that felt convincing but weren't real. That had to be it. The clown's head must have been tilted like that the whole time. His mind was filling in gaps the way tired minds do, bending reality, inventing motion where there was none. He repeated that explanation in his head until the words sounded almost believable. Almost. Dalton pushed himself to his feet again. He approached the clown one hesitant step at a time, keeping his gaze fixed on it, waiting for even the smallest twitch. There wasn't one. The figure sat frozen in its gaudy costume, same posture, same grin, same terrible eyes. He reached out slowly and brushed his fingers against its shoulder. The silk felt expensive beneath his touch, soft and cool at first. But underneath the fabric was something firm, like reinforced foam shaping a mannequin's frame. He told himself it was normal, just a well-made prop, something eccentric homeowners kept around for their own amusement. Then his skin registered it. Warmth. Not the type of warmth you got from a heated room. Not the ambient heat of a fireplace warming the air. This warmth was different, direct, natural, alive. Dalton snatched his hand back as if burned. His pulse thrashed against his ribs, loud enough to drown out the crackle of the fire. The heat from the fireplace, he insisted silently. The fire had been burning for almost an hour. Of course, objects in the room would heat up. He was jumpy because he'd spent too many years in places where paranoia kept you breathing. He needed something to settle his nerves. Back in the kitchen, he rummaged through a wine rack until he found a dark green bottle with an elegant French label he couldn't pronounce. He didn't waste time searching for a glass. He drank straight from the bottle while watching the storm bury the world outside the window. The wine was rich and warm, spreading through him like a soft blanket. By the time he wandered back into the parlor, Half the bottle was gone, and the anxiety in his chest had relaxed into something quieter, more distant. The clown sat exactly where he'd left it, but its head was tilted to the opposite side again. Dalton set the wine bottle down gently, almost ceremonially, as if the slightest noise would cause something to break inside him. His hands were steady. He checked twice to be sure. Steady meant he wasn't imagining things. Steady meant he was thinking clearly. He walked directly up to the figure until they were nearly knee. Up close, the details leapt out with brutal clarity. An old brown stain on the collar, a scuffed toe on the left shoe, a loose thread dangling from one glove. And the eyes. God, the eyes. In the dancing firelight, they no longer looked like paint at all. There was depth behind them, moisture, a faint reflective sheen no brush could create. These weren't painted ornaments. These were real eyes, human eyes, starring from behind some kind of transparent coating. "You're not real," Dalton whispered. His voice sounded wrong in the room, too small, too brittle. "You're just something someone put here, that's all." The clown remained still, unmoving, lifeless. And yet, as Dalton leaned closer, trying to see past the colored lenses, he saw something that ripped the air from his lungs. The silk-covered torso rose, just slightly, as if drawing in a breath. It wasn't much, a faint lift, the kind of movement you'd miss if you blinked, but it happened. Dalton stood there, frozen, watching the silk over the clown's chest rise barely a finger's width, then sink again, then rise, then sink. A rhythm, a pulse, breathing, a living cadence nestled inside that painted nightmare. Dalton staggered backward so fast he collided with a chair. The wine bottle toppled, rolled on its side, and poured a dark red stain across the rug like a spreading wound. He didn't even look at it. Every shred of his attention clung to the figure in the corner, the slight swell of its chest, the subtle fall, the impossible repetition of it. He whispered the only words his mouth could shape. "Oh God, no, no." His brain scrambled for explanations, any explanation. Maybe there was a person in the costume, someone down on their luck like him. Maybe they'd gotten here first and hid when he came in. But why hide? Why sit motionless for hours? And why not bolt when Dalton rummaged through the kitchen? Why breathe so shallowly it barely registered? That theory collapsed instantly. Something else was happening. Something colder, more deliberate. Someone or something had been sitting there the entire time, watching him chew, watching him drink, watching him warm himself and rest, waiting for something he couldn't understand. His gaze darted to the fireplace. The iron poker leaned in its stand, blackened at the tip, 2 feet long, thick, heavy, a good weapon in a place without comfort or certainty. Dalton grabbed it. The weight grounded him, gave him purpose. It felt like the only solid truth left in the room. "I know you're alive," he said, his voice raw but steady. Anger was finally pushing through the terror, and anger was a tool he understood. "I don't know what your game is, but it ends right now. You hear me? Stand up, move, do something." Then he saw it. The clown's gaze shifted. No more staring past him. No fixed, empty point. Those eyes, those glistening, horrifyingly real eyes, locked onto Dalton's face with perfect clarity, like 2 wells of wet glass reflecting the firelight. A tear slid out. Not a painted trip, not a smudge in the grease paint. An actual tear. It cut a trembling line down the clown's cheek, wiping a narrow path through the white makeup and exposing a patch of human skin underneath. Dalton's breath stuttered. He tightened his grip on the poker until his knuckles ached. "Last warning," he growled, stepping forward. "Get up, walk out that door. I swear I'm not bluffing." The figure didn't rise, didn't flinch, didn't even try. It simply remained. Not immobile by force, immobile by decision, by choice. Dalton could feel it now, something in the air shifting around him, something that made his instincts scream. This wasn't a dog. This wasn't a squatter. This wasn't someone trying to scare him. This was something caught in a place between motion and stillness. Something that knew he was there long before he knew it existed. Another tear rolled down its cheek, joining the first, carving a second clean trail. The two lines gleamed in the flickering firelight like cracks running through porcelain. The clown didn't look away. The eyes stayed fixed on his, and in them Dalton saw something sickeningly human, not just fear, but a deeper emotion woven underneath it, something that made his gut twist. A plea. A silent, desperate plea for something he didn't understand. Not yet. He felt it hit him all at once. Not relief, not fear, but the horrible recognition that he was finally seeing the truth of what sat across the room. Dalton let the iron bar slip from his hand. His fingers wouldn't stop trembling, not from the cold storm he'd escaped, but from the awful clarity sinking into his bones. He stepped toward the figure in the corner, each footfall quieter than the last, as if sound itself might break whatever fragile reality he'd walked into. Up close, the clown wasn't a prop at all. The colors on its face were caked and crumbling like old plaster peeling off a wall, and when Dalton brushed his fingertips across the cheek, he felt warmth, living warmth, hiding beneath the hardened mask of paint. Under that shell, he could sense real skin muscle, even the delicate throb of a pulse near the temple. The grin wasn't carved. It was a human mouth, glued into place by layers of dry pigment. Dalton recoiled so sharply he almost toppled backward. His thoughts scrambled, clashing into each other, desperate to explain why someone would dress a living person like this, and leave them frozen in a corner like a festival decoration, waiting for guests that would never arrive. He forced himself to breathe, picked the poker back up, not as a weapon, but as a way to keep distance. "Can you move?" His voice cracked. "If you can, show me somehow." Nothing happened. The figure didn't flinch, didn't twitch, only stared at him with heavy, exhausted awareness. Those eyes were awake, terrifyingly awake. "Do you understand me?" Dalton whispered. The silence stretched so long, he almost gave up. Then slowly, painfully, the eyelids sank and lifted once. The bottom dropped out of Dalton's stomach. Whoever this was could think, could hear him, could feel everything, but they were trapped inside their own body, forced to sit still and smile while time passed around them. He scanned the room as if seeing it anew. A fireplace ready to light but untouched, lamps burning even though no one lived here. No sign of luggage, coats, shoes, nothing that suggested anyone used this enormous house except the breathing statue in the corner. His instincts screamed at him to leave. Get back to the storm outside, brave the wind, pretend he'd never crossed the threshold. He owed nothing to whoever had been left like this. He wasn't their savior. But he didn't run. Those eyes held him rooted to the floor, pleading, terrified, and so full of silent suffering that they echoed the same hopelessness he once felt in the facility that treated him like a number instead of a person. Without meaning to, the question slipped out of him. "Who did this to you?" He swallowed, tightened his grip on the poker, and forced himself to continue. Blink once if it was someone you know, twice if it was a stranger. A long shaking moment passed. Then came a single, deliberate blink. Dalton's heart hammered against his ribs. Someone from their own blood, their own home, had done this. And that realization was only the beginning. Something about the whole scene tugged at him in a way he couldn't explain, not just shock now, but a deep dread curling in his gut. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't a prank. It wasn't a moment of anger gone too far. It was ritual, calculated, cruelty crafted with patience. Dalton's gaze drifted over the details he'd missed earlier, and suddenly everything clicked into place in the worst possible way. There was a sour chemical scent hiding under the smell of the fireplace, and his own damp coat, sterile, hospital-like. His eyes traveled downward and saw the swollen outline beneath the oversized pants, adult incontinence briefs, layers of them. His breath caught. Whoever put this man here hadn't expected him to move, hadn't wanted him to. They expected him to stay like this. Then he noticed the tube, a narrow, transparent line threading from under the frilled collar, slipping behind the chair into the shadows. His stomach clenched as he traced its path with his eyes until he spotted the hanging bag, half lit by firelight, half swallowed in darkness. A feeding line. This wasn't fear-induced paralysis. This was a setup built to last days, maybe longer. Someone had arranged every detail, down to keeping their victim alive, just enough to make the suffering stretch. Dalton swallowed hard. His throat felt raw. He'd seen hurt before in the facility on the streets, even in the house he grew up in, but this was different. This was the sort of torment only someone close could devise, a cruelty sharpened by familiarity. "How long have you been like this?" he murmured, then caught himself. The man couldn't answer. The grotesque painted smile was sealed stiff, and behind those lips, Dalton could now see the tongue, frozen in place, unable to shape a single sound. He fumbled for his phone, hope rising instinctively, and died the second he saw the black screen. Dead, completely drained. He'd been rationing it for days, and the cold storm outside must have sucked away whatever life remained. There had to be another way. He stumbled through the hallway until he found what he was looking for, a landline phone mounted on the wall, the kind that belonged in an old mansion like this. Heavy receiver, circular dial, polished brass. It looked like it should ring ghosts instead of emergency services. He lifted the receiver. Not even a hum. Just empty, suffocating silence. A cold dread prickled at the back of his neck. He tugged the cord down to where it met the baseboard. The wire had been sliced straight through, exposing bright copper, clean, deliberate, recent. Whoever had done this hadn't only planned it. They made sure no one could interrupt it. Dalton returned to the parlor, feeling the storm outside clawing at the windows like it wanted to warn him away. But he couldn't leave, not now. Not after seeing those eyes follow him with a desperate kind of hope. He pulled a chair close, the legs scraping softly against the rug, and sat only a few feet away from the painted figure. It looked different now. Not monstrous, not decorative. Just tragically human. Close enough he could make out faint creases around the eyes, the kind you get from decades of smiling, or maybe decades of worrying. A few silver hairs peeked through where the thick paint had cracked and rubbed thin. The shape of the jaw, the slack skin around the neck. This wasn't some abandoned performer. This was an elderly man. A grandfather, maybe. A father. Someone who had lived a full life. until someone decided to turn him into furniture. Dalton felt the heat of the fire behind him, but a coldness spread through his chest, old and familiar. The kind of cold that came from knowing no one else was coming to help. And somehow, without even fully understanding why, he knew the truth. This man had been left here by someone who loved him once, and they hadn't expected him to ever get back up. Dalton let out a shaky breath, the kind a person gives when their mind finally admits the truth. "I don't even know where to start," he murmured. Speaking aloud felt strange, like confessing to the darkness, but the man's eyes wouldn't let him lie. They held him there, asking for honesty without a word. "The house line's dead," Dalton said quietly. "My phone's useless, and outside." He glanced toward the window, where the storm had plastered the glass with white. "We wouldn't even reach the road." The man blinked once, a slow, measured gesture that almost looked like acceptance. "But I can't just leave you here," Dalton whispered. "Not like this, not dressed in this, not waiting for whoever did this to return." The words lodged in his throat. He didn't want to finish the sentence, didn't want to imagine what coming back would mean for this man. Dalton stepped closer, fingertips brushing the thick crust of paint on the man's cheek. It felt like peeling old glue. It must have hurt going on. It would hurt even more coming off. But leaving it there, leaving him sealed in that grotesque mask, was unbearable. He stood abruptly and headed for the kitchen. He rummaged through cabinets until he found dish soap, a bowl, and a stack of soft cloths. He filled the bowl with warm water and carried everything back to the parlor. When he knelt again, the man's eyes followed him with a trembling, fragile hope. "Let's try to get this off," Dalton said. He soaked a cloth, wrung it out, and pressed it gently against the painted skin. The white layer loosened first, smearing across the cloth in streaks. Beneath it emerged pale skin, mottled with tiny broken vessels. The harsh red circles on the cheeks softened into nothing. The blue diamonds around the eyes dissolved into cloudy trails. Dalton worked slowly, afraid to cause pain, but the man endured it in silence. Every once in a while he blinked, a soft, tired flutter. Dalton couldn't tell if it meant thank you or please be careful. Bit by bit, the artificial face melted away. Underneath was an elderly man whose features had been carved thin by months of starvation and neglect. The skin sagged softly over sharp bones. His eyes, now unobscured, were a washed-out mix of gray and green, shining with exhaustion and something deeper, sorrow maybe. When the painted grin finally dissolved, Dalton saw the truth underneath. Cracked lips drawn tight, holding back rage or grief or both. A normal mouth, a human mouth, and somehow that was the most heartbreaking part. "There," Dalton whispered, that's you." The man blinked once, faint but clear. Dalton eased back onto his heels, taking in the hideous mismatch of the bright costume and the real, suffering person inside it. The silly ruffles, the oversized shoes, none of it looked remotely humorous now. It looked like humiliation sculpted into fabric. He swallowed hard. "Your family did this to you." The question was barely a breath. The man didn't hesitate. One heavy, I'm not a good man," Dalton said finally. He couldn't look at the withered face in the chair. "I came in here tonight to rob you. That was the plan. But this..." He gestured helplessly, his voice cracking. "I don't know how people get so twisted they can do something like this to someone they're supposed to care about." The man blinked once, slow and steady, understanding. "Did you teach them that?" Dalton asked softly. A long, aching pause, then 2 blinks. "No." Dalton swallowed. Does it even matter? The man's eyes closed. For a long time, Dalton feared he drifted away, but then they opened again, shimmering with tears. One blink. Yes, it mattered. Dalton nodded, the realization settling heavy on his shoulders. People learned cruelty the same way they learned kindness, from what they saw, from what they survived. The old man's children hadn't invented their viciousness out of thin air. Somewhere, someone had carved that lesson into them long before this night. But understanding didn't make it righteous. It only made it sadder, softer around the edges, inevitable but still unforgivable. Morning eventually pushed its way into the house, dim light leaking through the snow-packed windows. The storm was still raging, though less violently now. Dalton pushed open the back door a few inches before realizing it was hopeless. The snow was several feet deep, a white wall holding them prisoner. When he returned to the parlor, the man's eyes were open, steady, patient. The expression of someone who no longer measured life in hours, but in heartbeats and breaths. "I'm staying," Dalton told him. "At least until the storm moves on. I'll make sure you're." He faltered. "What comfortable safe?" The words felt absurd in a room like this. Still, the man blinked once. "Stay." So Dalton stayed. He tended the fire, keeping it alive as the temperature dropped. He swapped out the feeding bag carefully, following the path of tubes with the careful logic of someone afraid to make things worse. He adjusted blankets, opened curtains to let in the faint daylight, and brushed stray flakes of dried paint from the rug. And somewhere between the rising and falling of the wind, he came to understand something he'd never realized before. True horror didn't come from monsters or shadows or the supernatural. It came from people, the ordinary, everyday cruelty they chose, and the quiet, unbearable suffering they left behind. Dalton sank into the chair, staring at the man in the corner, and the truth pressed in around him like the weight of the storm outside. Horror wasn't lurking monsters or shadows. Real horror was human. It was intimate. It was the slow, suffocating understanding that the people who were supposed to love you, to protect you, could watch your suffering and decide to magnify it, to turn helplessness into theater. Real horror was being trapped in your own body, while someone painted your face like a grotesque mask. Real horror was knowing your children hated you enough to make your final days a cruel joke. Real horror was being seen, and having it change nothing. By the second day, Dalton felt the compulsive need to understand the house, to map its secrets, though not for gain. Theft had lost its appeal. Curiosity, necessity, empathy that drove him. He explored the second floor, its air thick with old leather dust and the faint, sterile scent of wealth. The study drew him in, lined with books and papers yellowed at the edges. Dalton carefully opened each drawer, sifting through stacks of correspondence, legal documents, and bank statements. In the center drawer, deliberately obvious, lay a document that made him freeze. Letterhead, Whitefield Marsh and Associates, attorneys at law. Last will and testament of Harrison James Whitefield, dated September 15, 2 months after the stroke that had reduced the old man to this state. Dalton scanned the pages, reading with rising disbelief. Most of the estate, the house, investments, textile shares were willed to the New England Children's Hospital and the Hartford Arts Foundation. Each of the 3 children, Jeffrey, Diana, and Mitchell, received $50,000. Not insignificant, but not the fortune they likely expected. At the bottom, in faint, shaky handwriting, a single line. They know why. The placement was intentional, left where Harrison could see it from his wheelchair before being moved downstairs, before the costume, before the cruel charade. a final, private indictment of the children who had turned him into a spectacle. Dalton set the will down as if it might scorch his hands. He continued his search methodical now, moving through the largest bedroom upstairs. Jeffrey. Swimming trophies and Yale pennants crowded the shelves, silent markers of privilege and expectation. On the nightstand, a leather day planner caught his eye. The last entry, dated December 17th at 3 p.m., read, "Confirmed delivery." Beneath it, a phone number with a New Haven area code. On the dresser, a framed photograph showed the family from 2 decades past. Harrison stood in the center, arms crossed, stern and imposing. The 3 teenagers, Jeffrey, Diana, and Mitchell, orbited him like satellites, smiles absent, eyes sharp with self-importance. On the back, a neat hand, probably Diana's, had annotated the names with the precision of someone cataloging history, making sure the story of control and hierarchy was preserved. Dalton traced the outlines of the faces, feeling the weight of choices, of cruelty folded into inheritance and expectation. Every corner of the room whispered the same lesson. Some horrors aren't supernatural. They're handed down, they're learned, and they linger long after the storm ends. Christmas of 1998 lingered like a bruise in Dalton's mind. He imagined the memory, Harrison's voice cutting through the holiday cheer, telling Jeffrey he'd never be anything. A cracked photograph sat on the floor, glass fractured diagonally, splitting Harrison's face in 2. Dalton handled it carefully, then moved on, the weight of decades pressing silently around him. In the kitchen, the evidence was subtle, hidden where only someone paying attention would find it. Dalton rifled through drawers and cupboards, finally discovering a printed itinerary tucked inside a glossy French cookbook, the kind meant for display, not use. The pages fell open as if meant to be found. Cancun Palace Resort, December 18th through March 3rd. 3 rooms, 11 weeks. The precision was deliberate, the planning cold. The receipt was harder. He searched 3 trash bins before discovering it, coffee stained, damp, and crumbling at the edges. He carefully pieced it together like a fragile puzzle. Costume, New Haven. Total, $347.82, maybe $341.82. The date stamp had smudged, but December 16th lingered faintly. Paid in cash. No traceable credit card, no digital trail. Standing in the icy garage, Dalton felt understanding settle like frozen water over his chest. They had been meticulous, careful to leave nothing incriminating, yet careless enough to underestimate anyone who would actually look. In their arrogance, there was no crime, just a dying man and 3 children conveniently away on vacation. They never imagined someone would sift through a coffee-stained, near-ruined receipt and uncover intent. Returning to the parlor, Harrison's eyes met his immediately. Dalton's voice was quiet, measured. "Your children," he waited, searching for some sign. The eyes moved left, right, then left 3 times. Cancun, 1 deliberate blink. Yes. The wind rattled the windows, a ghostly accompaniment to the truth Dalton now held. He didn't need to ask about the will, the costume, or the planning. The evidence was clear enough. 3 children, cut out of their father's fortune, had chosen to respond with calculated cruelty. Meticulous, unforgiving, intentional. And now Dalton understood the depth of it all. And the small mercy of not letting a man die alone. Dalton settled back into the chair across from him. The fire hissed as a log split, a tiny sound in the vast, oppressive quiet. The house felt like a mausoleum now, warm on the surface, hollow beneath. Harrison's breath rasped through the tube, thin and fragile as cobweb thread. Dalton tried to pretend there was something to plan, something to weigh, but the truth sat heavy and immovable. There were no good choices, If he left, the children would return eventually, see the smallest thing move, a blanket shifted, a feeding tube adjusted. They would know someone had been here. They would wonder what he had seen. They would wonder if he had told anyone. And they would react the way people like them always did, quietly, efficiently, with no more emotion than they'd shown their father. If he stayed and called for help, it would bring the same result. His face, his name, his past, all of it would be on record. The Whitefield siblings wouldn't care that he tried to save their father. They'd only care that he knew. Staying was the only choice that didn't end with more suffering. Dalton leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and studied Harrison's face. The paint was gone now, but the memory of it lingered like an old bruise. The clown costume, the ruffled collar, it all seemed even crueler in the daylight. A final humiliation, a last joke, a monument to resentment carved over decades. You want me to stay until? Dalton couldn't finish the sentence. Harrison's eyes softened. One blink, yes. Dalton exhaled slowly, like air escaping a cracked pipe. All right, he said. I'll stay. The house gave a long groan, as if in agreement. Hours passed. Dalton fed the fire, adjusted blankets, wiped the man's lips when they cracked. He tried not to think about time or consequences or what would happen when the siblings returned in March and found their father gone. He tried not to think about what he would do after. Outside, the sun dipped behind the frozen trees, turning the snow a pale blue. Inside, the fire cast soft, trembling light across the room. You know, Dalton said quietly, I don't think your children hated you because of the money. Harrison's eyes shifted, curious. I think they hated you because you were their father. Dalton's voice was gentle, almost apologetic. And sometimes that's enough. The man blinked once, slowly acceptance. The room grew dimmer. The fire burned lower. Dalton pulled another blanket over Harrison's legs, tucking it in like one might for a child. The old man's breaths were shallow now, like he was growing tired of even that small effort. Dalton sat beside him, close enough for their shoulders to almost touch. I'll stay, he whispered. I'll be here. Harrison's eyes closed. This time, they stayed closed longer, as if the body beneath them had begun to surrender. Night crept in, silence deepened. Dalton watched the rise and fall of the old man's chest, steady but weakening, and understood that the real horror wasn't death at all. It was the life that had led to this moment, unseen, unprotected, dressed in a clown suit by the very people who should have held his hand. And in that quiet room, with the storm gone and the world outside frozen in place, Dalton waited, not to save him, just so he wouldn't leave this world as he had lived in it. Unheard, unseen, unwanted. Even as he thought it, he knew it wouldn't be enough. Not for long. Harrison's body had grown accustomed to the precision, the measured sustenance his children had arranged, and anything less felt fragile, temporary, a mockery of care. Dalton sank into a chair, rubbing his eyes, the weight of responsibility pressing on him like the roof above buried in snow. He moved slowly, deliberately, gathering cans, jars, and whatever soft foods he could salvage. Every movement was measured, every step a silent negotiation with the silence in the room. Harrison's eyes followed him, tracking, registering, understanding without speaking. Dalton spooned warm oatmeal into a bowl, mashed it with care, and fed it gently past the frozen, painted lips. The old man swallowed, a weak, rattling sound, but it was enough to keep him alive another day. Days passed in this quiet rhythm, feeding, cleaning, talking, reading aloud. Dalton began telling stories of the outside world, of streets and parks, of people who smiled at strangers, of sunlight on a clear morning. Harrison listened, blinking in response, sometimes once, sometimes twice, his eyes carrying the weight of decades of silence and fear. Dalton realized that the man wasn't just trapped physically. He was trapped in memory and grief, in a world that had become cruel long before Dalton had arrived. He started keeping a journal, scribbling the small routines, the blinks, the ways Harrison communicated. It was the only record of their strange coexistence, a testament to endurance and patience in the face of calculated cruelty. Dalton learned the rhythm of the feeding tube, the exact warmth the blankets needed, the way Harrison's eyes shifted when he grew anxious or alert. One evening, Dalton sat by the fire, wine in hand, watching the shadows dance across the walls. "You did what you thought was right," he said softly. "But sometimes, even what we call love, it doesn't look like love at all." Harrison's eyes, watery and gray-green, blinked twice, a slow acknowledgement. Dalton didn't need to push further. The truth hung in the air, heavy, unspoken, but understood. Snow continued to melt outside, revealing the brown, lifeless patches of a yard that had seen better days. Dalton looked at Harrison, fragile and gaunt beneath the absurd costume, and understood something profound. Survival wasn't just about food or warmth. It was about being seen, being acknowledged, being kept alive in the only way someone still could. He stayed day after day, keeping the fire alive, tending to the body that could no longer tend itself, speaking aloud as if the walls themselves might answer. And in those long, quiet hours, Dalton realized that real horror wasn't over. It lingered in the cracks, in the waiting, in the way people could hurt each other with calculated precision. But real courage was here too, in persistence, in attention, in refusing to abandon someone even when the world had already done so. Harrison blinked once deliberately, and Dalton understood. The storm outside could pass, but the storm within these walls, the cruel weight of a family's betrayal, would never fully leave. Yet he would stay, because sometimes the only thing you can do for someone is to be present. And for Harrison Whitefield, that presence was everything. Folded and refolded, he wiped down surfaces, straightened books, set the room back into the quiet, curated order it had before he arrived. Before the storm, before the waiting, before the small, fragile companionship that had taken shape between two men who had nothing left but presence. Outside, meltwater dripped from the eaves in slow, irregular beats. It should have felt like a beginning. Instead, it felt like an accusation. Dalton moved through the house with a kind of reverence. Every room he passed held the ghost of a moment. Harrison watching him from the parlor, blinking answers. The study with its damning will. The kitchen where Dalton had mashed oatmeal that would never be eaten. The cold garage where a crumpled receipt had revealed a truth no one wanted to name. He paused at the doorway to Jeffrey's old room. The cracked photograph still sat on the dresser, Harrison's face split cleanly down the middle. Dalton didn't touch it. Some things were meant to stay broken. When the house looked untouched again, like no one had ever waited here, suffered here, died here, Dalton put on his coat. The snow had thinned enough that he could see the curved shape of the driveway, the dark path cutting toward the road. Soon someone would come, a neighbor, a delivery driver, someone curious about why lights still burned in empty windows. Dalton stood at the threshold and looked back into the parlor for the last time. Harrison lay exactly as he had left him. Dignity restored only in death, painted face stiff, but no longer humiliating, blankets neatly arranged, eyes gently closed. A man who had survived everything except the people he had raised. "You deserved better," Dalton murmured. knowing the walls wouldn't answer. Then he stepped out into the cold morning air. The world outside was bright, painfully bright, as if nature had no patience for grief. His boots crunched through the snow. The sky was a hard, clear blue. Somewhere far off, a plow rumbled along the main road, indifferent to everything that had happened in this house. Dalton didn't look back again. He walked until the house disappeared behind the curve of the drive, until it was nothing but a memory buried under snow and silence. Whatever came next, questions, investigations, the quiet return of the Whitefield children to claim what they believed was theirs, would unfold without him. He had done the only thing he could do. He had stayed, he had witnessed, he had not let the old man die alone. And in a world where cruelty often went unseen, unheard, unchallenged, that was something. Cancun to a scene carefully staged to hide everything and reveal just enough. They would see the burned, warped remnant of what had been a grotesque mask, the quiet evidence of their cruelty left in plain sight yet indecipherable. A warning only he understood, a message for those who had thought they could erase their father's suffering and walk away untouched. Dalton kept walking, boots sinking into slushy patches of snow and mud. Each step carried the weight of what he witnessed, what he had preserved, and what he had destroyed. The world beyond the driveway felt indifferent, but inside him, a storm of understanding raged, of cruelty, neglect, and the strange, fragile mercy of simply being there for someone when no one else would. By the time he reached the next town, the morning sun had burned away most of the mist, revealing streets full of ordinary life. Children waiting for school buses, cars gliding over wet asphalt, neighbors greeting one another with casual cheer. Nothing here knew the horrors that had transpired just miles away. Dalton blended into it effortlessly, a drifter, a shadow moving through an indifferent world, carrying knowledge the rest of them would never comprehend. Back at the house, the snow continued to melt around the edges of the driveway. Inside, Harrison's body rested peacefully, the pajamas soft and natural, the chair upright as if nothing had happened. The fire had burned low, leaving warm embers that glowed like a quiet heartbeat. The small, burned nose sat on the side table, innocuous to the untrained eye, a silent witness to the truth of the last days of the man who had been trapped in his own body, forced to endure the ultimate betrayal. When the Whitefield children returned, they would find a home intact, seemingly untouched, yet with subtle signs that someone had been here. Evidence so carefully handled it would raise no alarms. Yet for Dalton, that small, warped piece of foam rubber, blackened, melted, unrecognizable, would carry the weight of everything. A record of cruelty, a testament to endurance, and a quiet, unspoken warning to the ones who thought themselves untouchable. He never looked back. The house faded behind him as he walked into the distance, the road ahead open, the snow retreating under the sun. He carried with him the burden of witnessing, of understanding, and of acting when no one else could. He had done what was necessary. He had seen it. He had preserved the truth. And in that silent, unremarkable act, he had restored a fragment of justice that no one else could touch. Cancun. They would return eventually, going through the motions, mourning in public, arranging the funeral, signing the papers, dividing the modest inheritance. And one of them, probably Jeffrey, the oldest, would step into that silent parlor. He would see the small, burned piece on the side table, pick it up, turn it over, and finally realize someone had been here. Someone had seen everything. Someone knew. The message wasn't loud, wasn't threatening. It was quiet, precise, and impossible to ignore. Their secret had slipped past invisibility. Someone had borne witness, and that knowledge alone was a reckoning. They would never know who left it. They would never know why. Only that the truth had survived them, and that would have to be enough. Dalton walked on, the road stretching ahead beneath the soft glow of the early evening. Behind him, the past dissolved into frozen memory, but the eyes remained, etched into his mind, gray-green, patient, aware. Eyes that had endured incomprehensible cruelty, that had pleaded silently for recognition, for someone to see. And in the end, Dalton's presence, his careful tending, and the burned remnant left on the table became the only justice either of them would ever hold. Story 2, The Woman at the Hot Desk. She had been there for 6 weeks, sitting quietly at the hot desk near the supply closet, before Nicola realized she didn't know her name. That should have been ordinary. They employed dozens on the 8th floor, temps and staff constantly cycling in and out. But something about her gnawed at Nicola, a low-level unease she couldn't name. The way a picture crooked on a wall irritates your eye even when you aren't looking directly. They had exchanged words, sure, small talk by the kettle, comments about the weather, a brief, forgettable discussion about parking. Conversations that began and ended without leaving a mark, yet somehow stayed lodged in her memory as an odd blank space. The woman's uniform was deliberately neutral. Navy trousers from Marks and Spencer, white blouses buttoned at the throat, cardigans in muted shades of gray or beige. Her hair was always in a tight bun, never straying. She could have been 40, 50, or somewhere in between. The kind of face you passed in a supermarket without noticing. And then on a Thursday evening in November, as Nicola wrapped up the quarterly audit, a name came to her as if pulled from the air. Gwen Bridget. She must have introduced herself at some point, mentioned it during one of those fleeting, forgettable exchanges. But somehow in all that time, Nicola had never remembered. Now she did, and it felt like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed. From the moment Nicola realized the name, it had settled in her mind like a shadow that had always been there, quiet, persistent, unavoidable. She didn't remember Gwen Pritchard introducing herself, only the sensation that she had always existed in the office, just beyond notice. Nicola's life revolved around observation. As a compliance officer, her role was to catch what others believed invisible, expense claims that bent the rules, timesheets that made impossible demands on physics, tiny manipulations people called shortcuts because everyone did it. She excelled at this because she was accustomed to solitude. Focused, methodical, impervious to distractions, she could see patterns that others overlooked. Her ex-husband used to complain that she noticed everything except what truly mattered. He said it once years ago, over a dinner that had ended in quiet tension. Their daughter, 16 at the time, had already begun retreating, weaving invisible barriers between herself and them. Nicola had been dissecting the office gossip, another colleague's affair, and David had looked at her with that combination of exasperation and disbelief. "You can tell me what everyone ate 3 weeks ago," he had said, voice sharp. "But you can't tell me why our daughter won't speak to us anymore." Nicola had known. She had noticed every subtle withdrawal, every fleeting deflection, every practiced blank expression that screamed secrecy. She had simply lacked a map for how to respond. That was 5 years ago. Gemma had moved to Manchester, living with a man Nicola had met once and dismissed as ordinary. They spoke on Sundays, polite, brief exchanges about work, the weather, whether Gemma was eating properly, though at 21, she was more than capable of caring for herself. David had moved on as well, settling into Wimbledon with a woman who filled her world with yoga and crystals. Nicola, meanwhile, lived alone in a flat that was too expensive and too silent. In the stillness, she noticed everything. But Gwen Pritchard had eluded notice in a way that fascinated her. Everyone had seen Gwen, her presence, her movements, but no one had truly looked. Gwen appeared in the office one late September morning, seemingly planted at the hot desk by the supply cupboard, perfectly ordinary in a way that made it impossible to question. She wore the corporate armor of invisibility, navy trousers, a pristine white blouse buttoned to the throat, a cardigan in subtle grays and muted beiges. Her hair was brown streaked with gray, arranged in a flawless bun that never faltered. She could have been 40 or 50, but no one placed her age exactly. She existed in the gaps between attention, moving through the office without leaving a ripple, yet somehow filling the space with quiet authority. Nicola realized she had been seeing Gwen all along, just not really seeing her. And that, she thought, was the point. Some people occupy a room without ever asking to be noticed, and some observers exist for whom noticing is the only way to survive. Gwen was both, and now, finally, Nicola was paying attention. Gwen was likely around 50, the sort of person you passed in a supermarket aisle without a second thought, the kind of presence that blurred seamlessly into the background. Later, when Nicola allowed herself a few quiet hours for reflection, she would recognize the brilliance of Gwen's approach. She had mastered the invisible art of the modern office. People no longer truly saw one another. At Henry and Marsh, 43 employees crowded the open-plan floor, excluding temps. On any given day, perhaps half a dozen exchanged a glance. The rest were buried in screens, spreadsheets, and self-contained routines. One could drift through the office for weeks, sit at unused desks, eat in the canteen, use the restroom, and no one would ever question who you were or why you were there. In the 6 weeks Gwen had quietly taken up a position at the hot desk by the supply cupboard, Nicola had spoken with her only a handful of times. Quick exchanges by the kettle, a comment about the weather, a short debate over parking. That last conversation had been unusual. The company lot was perpetually full, and Gwen had to rely on the street meters. Normally, Nicola avoided small talk, finding it far more exhausting than actual work. But something about Gwen made her linger. There was a stillness, a rare attentiveness that suggested she wasn't merely waiting for her turn to speak. Nicola found herself sharing more than she intended. The 3-year struggle to secure her own parking space, the absurdity of hot desking policies, even memories of her ex-husband picking her up when rain made commuting unbearable, a courtesy from a past life where small kindnesses still existed. Gwen had listened, hands wrapped around a tea mug, her face composed in quiet attentiveness, never forcing engagement, never intruding. When Nicola finally ran out of words, realizing she had talked too long, Gwen offered a small, restrained smile. "I prefer not to make a fuss," she said, simple, final. Nicola suggested she could speak to facilities anyway, and Gwen's soft nod and polite thanks conveyed that the conversation had ended, not brusque, not dismissive, but complete. Gwen had been seen, but she had chosen what to reveal, and in that subtle control, she remained entirely her own. Office had grown quieter in a way that wasn't just empty, but deliberate, like the building itself was holding its breath. Nicola paused mid-step, a chill crawling up her spine despite the central heating. The usual hum of fluorescent lights and distant typing had faded, replaced by a hollow silence that seemed to stretch into every corner. Her mind ticked through the day again, each thought pressing heavier than the last. London's November gloom had descended early, the streets outside slick with rain and diesel fumes, the kind of evening that made every shadow feel longer, every reflection in the window more uncertain. She'd lingered at her desk because the quarterly audit was going to complete itself, and Jeremy Ashton's disaster of expense reports demanded precision, and patience she hadn't felt much of that day. Jeremy's mistakes were never accidental. He manufactured errors with the care of an artist, bogus restaurants, implausible mileage, receipts that defied logic. When challenged, he would offer that perfect mask of wounded innocence, the kind that made her question her own sanity. Emails sent all afternoon had gone unanswered, and by 5:30 he disappeared, coat slung over his shoulder, carrying the careless confidence of someone who had never learned to watch, to notice, to consider. Nicola, by contrast, stayed because she had to. The numbers demanded attention. The office, even at its most desolate, provided a clarity her flat never could. There, the silence wasn't neutral, it was oppressive, a reminder of spaces left empty, of conversations that never happened. Here, discrepancies existed or they didn't, mistakes could be caught or left to fester. Life might be messy, but numbers didn't lie. By 7:50, the office had emptied, save for cleaners gliding between desks like a tide moving inexorably forward. Nicola saved her work, shut down her computer, and gathered her coat and bag, feeling that fleeting satisfaction of completing a task that had threatened to drag her down all day. The building would lock at 7:30. She wasn't about to linger for the security rounds at 10. Halfway to the lifts, already planning her route home and whether she would stop for groceries or scrape together dinner from her fridge, she noticed it. A presence in the corner of her vision, subtle, almost imperceptible. Something or someone was there, and for the first time that day, Nicola felt that familiar, unsettling sensation of being truly watched. The office was quiet, almost eerily so, the kind of silence that stretches thin and makes every sound feel amplified. A single light lingered over the hot desk near the supply corner, casting a pool of yellow against the otherwise dim floor. There she was, Gwen, sitting perfectly still, shoulders squared, fingers hovering over the keys like she had a message trapped in her hands but no intention of sending it. The laptop glowed with the soft, hypnotic blue of an idle screen, but it wasn't the screen that drew Nicola's gaze. It was Gwen herself, frozen in that uncanny posture, hair tucked neatly in a bun, gray cardigan draped over her shoulders, face mirrored in the darkened glass behind her. Nicola paused mid-step. The cleaners had drifted to the far end of the floor, their machines buzzing in low, distant thrum, almost like a heartbeat from another room. The overhead fluorescence had dulled after hours, flattening shadows and washing the space in an unnatural, photographic light. Normally, Nicola would have passed by, nodded a quick goodnight, and disappeared toward the lifts. But something held her, an invisible weight pressing her feet to the carpet. The stillness wasn't ordinary. Gwen's reflection seemed slightly misaligned, her eyes following a different plane than her own. She had been sitting like this long enough for it to become unnatural, time stretching around her. Experience had trained Nicola to recognize anomalies. Late-night workers fidgeted, sipped lukewarm coffee, rubbed eyes. They adjusted chairs, stretched fingers. But Gwen was different, rigid, almost statuesque, as if the world had paused and left her behind. Each step Nicola took felt loud, too deliberate on carpet that should have swallowed sound. Gwen didn't move. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Stepping closer, Nicola noticed the subtle details she'd missed before. A faint brown smudge on the sleeve cuff of the cardigan, stubborn against countless washings. One side of her blouse collar tucked slightly under, imperfectly perfect in an otherwise flawless ensemble. The fingers resting on the keyboard were tense, unnaturally curved, suggesting hours without relief, a quiet discomfort held in check. There was patience here, yes, but also something else, intent. Gwen, Nicola's voice rang too loudly in the empty office, breaking the spell. The sound seemed foreign, alien, harsh against the muted hum of machinery and the soft blue glow of the screen. Slowly, deliberately, Gwen lifted her head. Her gaze met Nicola's, steady, as if waking from some deep, solitary trance. The faintest smile tugged at her lips, tight, controlled, almost imperceptible. But there was something in it that didn't belong to the ordinary office rhythms. The kind of smile that makes you realize time has passed differently here, measured in silence, in stillness, in observation. And in that instant, Nicola understood. She wasn't looking at someone merely working late. She was witnessing someone who had mastered invisibility, not through anonymity, but through total command of presence. Every detail, every frozen gesture, every quiet breath had purpose. Gwen hadn't been lost in the glow of a screen. She had been waiting, watching, existing on a plane Nicola hadn't yet comprehended. The office no longer felt like a workspace. It had become a stage, and Nicola unwillingly had stepped into the scene. The fluorescent lights, the distant hum of the cleaners, the damp November evening pressing against the windows, all of it faded into the periphery. There was only Gwen and the silent gravity of the space she occupied, a quiet force that demanded recognition even in a place designed to ignore. Nicola swallowed, her heartbeat loud in the hush, and realized she was no longer walking past. She was standing at the threshold of something she couldn't yet name, a presence that had been here all along, unnoticed until now. And in that moment, as the screen flickered and the reflection shifted subtly, she understood that some people aren't seen because no one bothers to look, but Gwen had been waiting for someone who would. A subtle shift flickered behind Gwen's eyes, almost imperceptible, an inner calculation, a mental adjustment. "I should go," she said softly, closing the laptop with a muted snap. Nicola noticed immediately. She hadn't gone through the motions of shutting it down, saving files, or quitting programs. The machine wasn't a tool here. It was a stage prop, a signal that whatever had happened at that desk didn't rely on screens or software to matter. They walked toward the lifts in companionable silence. Nicola's fingers hovered over the call button, watching the numbers above the doors tick down from 12. The building had 14 floors, but 13 had been skipped, an unnecessary superstition baked in for American clients who believed in cursed numbers. They were on the 8th. The lift didn't budge. Nicola pressed the button again. The down arrow glowed, orange against the dim lobby, but the numbers froze stubbornly at 12. Somewhere above, the cables hummed and vibrated faintly through the floor, teasing the possibility of motion. Gwen's voice broke the tension. Probably the cleaners. They wedge the doors sometimes. Not supposed to. "No," Nicola replied, but the word was more a whisper of acknowledgement than denial. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant drone of the buffer, the faint hum of the air conditioning, the measured tick of the wall clock beyond reception. Gwen stood near her, close enough that Nicola caught a hint of her scent, a soft, floral aroma, oddly nostalgic, like a second-hand boutique or a forgotten perfume in a charity shop. "The stairs," Gwen said simply. The emergency stairwell lay at the far end of the floor, past locked server rooms and the unassuming bathroom doors. A sign in stark red letters declared its purpose: "Fire exit, keep clear." Nicola realized she had never used it in 3 years at the company. The lifts always worked, or if not, waiting had always been simpler than exertion. But now it was 7:20 and the building would lock in 10 minutes. The thought of sitting idle on the 8th floor for hours felt worse than climbing 8 flights in heels. They moved together toward the stairwell. Each footfall echoed against the tiles, sharp and unnerving in the empty space. Gwen's stride was precise, mechanical almost, each step identical, her arms close to her sides, her bag pressed to her torso. She moved like a finely wound automaton, smooth and purposeful, yet somehow eerily human, a living mechanism rehearsing each motion with perfect efficiency. Nicola fell into step behind her, heart quickening, caught between fascination and unease. The quiet of the office had changed. Now it felt like a stage set, the two of them the only actors in a world where everything else had been hushed. And as the stairwell door swung open, releasing the faint scent of concrete and metal, Nicola realized she was no longer just heading home. She was stepping into something uncharted, guided by a presence she could neither fully read nor resist. Shadows cast by the stairwell lights, the scratches on the concrete, the distance between each flickering tube above. The air was cooler here, damp with the scent of cement and that faint, unsettling sweetness that clung to the corners. It made her stomach twist, the way certain smells could trigger memories you didn't want to remember, like fruit left to rot on a windowsill, ignored until it was unrecognizable. Gwen moved ahead with the same mechanical precision, arms close, head straight, every step deliberate, unhesitating. Nicola tried to keep pace, heels clicking against the bare steps, the echoes stretching endlessly in the narrow shaft. Each flight seemed longer than the last, the shadows deepening as they descended. The walls, streaked with old paint and the ghostly remnants of graffiti, felt almost alive under the flickering lights. They seemed to press inward, though Nicola knew it was just the angle, just the architecture playing tricks on her mind. She gripped the cold steel handrail, its surface smooth in places, greasy in others, a reminder of every hand that had passed over it before. The stairwell had a rhythm now. Click, thump, click. Gwen steps behind her, flawless and predictable, echoed like a metronome in the concrete corridor. Nicola couldn't help herself, she counted. 8 floors, 16 flights, hundreds of steps, and yet the air pressed down on her like something waiting, something patient. As they continued downward, the scent intensified, faintly floral now, mingled with the sweetness that made her stomach churn. Nicola swallowed, uneasy, feeling as if the stairwell itself was observing her, every step catalogued, every breath noted. Gwen didn't glance back, didn't speak, but Nicola felt the weight of her presence beside her, precise, unyielding, like a shadow given form. By the time they reached the lower levels, the fluorescent lights above seemed weaker, their flicker more insistent, as if the stairwell didn't want them to proceed. The shadows pooled in the corners, and every step echoed with an uncanny clarity, magnifying the sense that they were no longer alone, even though no one else was there. Nicola's grip tightened on the railing, handbag pressed to her side, and she realized she was no longer simply descending stairs. She was stepping into something unknown, a quiet tension that stretched taut with every measured footfall. And still, Gwen moved ahead, perfect and composed, guiding them both deeper into the concrete labyrinth, her silence as commanding as any instruction, leaving Nicola to wonder what waited at the bottom, and whether reaching it would change everything. Every step echoed in the stairwell, sharp and deliberate, bouncing off the concrete walls like a drumbeat marking time. Nicola found herself counting steps, landings, the faint vibrations under her shoes, as if numbering them could impose order on the uneasy tension coiling in her chest. It was an old habit, a way to tame chaos, the way she had once counted the seconds between her mother pouring tea and her father's footsteps on the hallway floor, each rhythm a small anchor in an unpredictable world. But here in the half-light of the stairwell, counting felt necessary for another reason. There was a scent drifting through the air that made her stomach twist. Dust and metal, yes, the tang of old concrete and the cold steel of the railing, but beneath that something else. Something faint, almost sweet, like fruit left too long in a forgotten bowl or flowers decaying in murky water. It lingered everywhere at once, impossible to locate, as if the stairwell itself exhaled it. They reached the landing of the 7th floor. Through the small square window in the fire door, Nicola glimpsed the empty office beyond. Desks stood abandoned, chairs pushed in, their reflective strips catching the pale glow of emergency lights. Shadows pooled between the cubicles. The place felt abandoned, hollow in a way that pricked at her imagination. For a heartbeat, she imagined the building emptied of everyone else, leaving just her and Gwen as witnesses to some secret no one dared speak. She shook her head. Of course, it was nothing. After 7:30 on a Thursday, the floors were empty. Nothing more sinister than the late hour and the quiet of routine. They pressed on. 6th floor, 5th. Each step made her calves burn in a way that reminded her she had chosen heels over practicality. She, meant to change into her trainers, kept neatly under her desk, but that decision belonged to another time. Going back up was no longer an option. Continuing downward, though taxing, felt unavoidable. And there was Gwen ahead of her, precise and silent, each step metronomic, measured, making Nicola's own heartbeat feel loud in comparison. The 4th floor landing greeted them with gloom. One of the fluorescent tubes had died, leaving a pool of near darkness. Gray light from above and below filtered in, turning walls and stairs into indistinct shapes. Nicola paused, letting her eyes adjust, taking a shallow breath that caught in her throat. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward her, every echo of her heels a reminder that the stairwell had its own rhythm, its own secret life she had no way to control. And still they descended, step by step, deeper into the building's quiet heart. The numbers, the counting, the smell, all of it anchored her, kept her grounded. And yet the pull of the unknown lingered, a quiet tension that whispered. Something awaited them at the bottom, and when they reached it, nothing would feel ordinary again. Someone moving with intent, not just a building settling or a door swinging on its own. Nicola froze, every muscle taut, her hand clutching the cold steel railing as if it could anchor her to something real. The air felt thicker now, heavier, pressing down on her lungs and making each breath a conscious effort. Gwen remained behind her, silent, still, her posture perfect. But Nicola could sense a shift, something in the way she held herself, the faint tilt of her head, as if she were listening to a signal only she could hear. A second door somewhere above them creaked, slow and deliberate, and the sound bounced down the stairwell like a pulse. Nicola's imagination raced. Was someone else here? Had the cleaners returned? But no, there was no shuffling, no distant hum of machinery, just the measured echoes of doors in the darkness. Her stomach tightened. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to flee, but the path was behind them. The only way forward was deeper into the shadowed stairwell. Her mind reached for rational explanations, for physics, for wiring, for echoing air currents. But the rational thoughts felt distant, muffled, as if the darkness had swallowed them. All she could do was move. She took a tentative step down, her heel tapping against concrete, the sound sharp and unnatural in the silence. Gwen followed immediately, her flat shoes making softer but equally deliberate sounds. Step by step they descended, and with each movement the stairwell seemed to contract around them, the walls leaning closer, the shadows thickening, smelling richer, heavier, almost alive. Nicola's pulse thundered in her ears, and every instinct in her body screamed that this place was no longer empty. She could feel it, not see it, but feel it, a presence just beyond the reach of her vision. And then from above came the faintest whisper of movement again. Another door, a subtle creak of hinges, a metal bar shifting ever so slightly. It was enough to make her stop mid-step, grip the railing with both hands and swallow the panic knotting her throat. Gwen's quiet presence beside her was unnerving. That small, controlled smile, that serene composure, it no longer felt comforting. Now it seemed almost knowing, as if Gwen understood something about the darkness that Nicola could not. Nicola swallowed hard, her chest tightening, and realized that in this stairwell, in this pitch-black corridor between floors, they were not alone. Something or someone was waiting, patient, deliberate, just above them, and every instinct screamed that what came next would not be accidental. Scraping across concrete with deliberate weight, not light, not accidental, but heavy, slow, purposeful, as if whatever it was had all the time in the world to make its presence known. Each scrape echoed against the stairwell walls, overlapping with the measured footfalls, creating a rhythm that made Nicola's chest tighten, made her stomach coil. Her hand clenched the railing so hard that the steel cut into her palm, leaving a sharp reminder that she was still very much alive and very much exposed. The air felt thicker now, almost viscous, carrying the faint, sweet rot she had noticed earlier, amplifying it, wrapping it around her like a shroud. She tried to tell herself it was her imagination, that it was just the combination of darkness and silence, but instinct screamed otherwise. The presence above, the rhythm of the steps and the scraping, the impossibly controlled breathing beside her, it all combined into a warning that she could not ignore. Gwen shifted slightly, imperceptibly, but it was enough for Nicola to sense a shift in the energy. Gwen was alert, not tense, not afraid, but fully present, aware of whatever was coming down the stairs. The realization struck Nicola. Gwen wasn't just a companion, she was an observer, a participant, and perhaps even a guide. But guide to what? To safety, or deeper into the unknown. The dragging noise grew closer, scraping in uneven pulses, each one punctuating the descending steps above. The sound was alive, purposeful, like someone or something was preparing, selecting, testing the space, the tension, the fear. Nicola's breath hitched. Every instinct screamed to run, to flee up the stairs, back into the artificial safety of lights and locked doors. But her feet felt rooted, her body betraying her mind. And then just above her, something shifted. A pause, a subtle hesitation that drew every ounce of attention to the sound. The silence afterward was deafening, a pregnant moment where nothing moved except the sound of their own hearts and the distant hum of electricity that had barely survived the blackout. Nicola realized with a jolt that the presence was directly above them now, poised, waiting, watching. Whatever came next would not be accidental. Whatever waited in that dark stairwell was deliberate, patient, and fully aware, and there was no turning back. Knuckles turned white. Every nerve in her body screamed that she had crossed an invisible line, that leaving now was no longer a simple choice. It was survival. Her eyes strained in the suffocating darkness, trying to pierce the shadows where the faint outlines of steps seemed to blur into one another. She counted silently, each number a fragile tether to reason, each breath a fragile anchor in the storm of panic swelling inside her. The dragging sound resumed, slower now, deliberate, punctuated by small metallic echoes that made her pulse spike. Above them, footsteps shuffled with a precision that betrayed calculation, not accident. This wasn't random, it was choreography, an invisible hand pulling the rhythm of fear through the stairwell like a conductor commanding an orchestra. Nicola's mind raced. Every rule she had followed, every observation she had trusted, suddenly felt useless. She had thought she understood patterns, schedules, human behavior, but the presence above her was rewriting everything she knew. Then Gwen's voice cut through the darkness, low and even, but unmistakable. "They won't find us." There was no warmth, no reassurance, only the quiet assertion of certainty, of control. It wasn't comforting. It was an announcement. Someone else was here, and they had already mapped every movement, every heartbeat, every shadow in the stairwell. Nicola's stomach clenched, a deep, visceral recognition that she was no longer in familiar territory. She shifted her weight, testing the next step with cautious precision. Concrete scraped under her heel, an echo that seemed to stretch for miles in the confined shack. Her handbag swung against her hip, a minor distraction that felt monumental in the thick tension. She forced herself to inhale to slow the rapid drum of her pulse, but the scent was stronger now, rotten sweet and metallic, curling around her like smoke from a fire she couldn't see. The silence between steps was deafening. Every small sound, the whisper of fabric, the scrape of leather against concrete, the faint, rhythmic pulse of Gwen's breathing, amplified her awareness of how alone she truly was. And then it hit her. Gwen wasn't guiding her. Gwen was waiting, watching, testing, teaching her something she didn't yet understand about attention, about vulnerability, about the weight of being noticed in a world that usually ignored you. Nicola gripped the railing tighter, forcing herself forward step by deliberate step. Each motion was calculated, each count a thread tying her to reality. The footsteps above resumed, closer now, scraping in tandem with some hidden rhythm. Fear sharpened her senses. Every shadow held possibility, every echo carried intent. She realized the mistake she had made weeks ago. The moment she had seen Gwen, dismissed her as ordinary, failed to understand the extraordinary patience and awareness in that still frame of a person. That error had led her here, into the heart of a darkness that wasn't merely absence of light, but a presence, a living, deliberate, inescapable presence. Nicola exhaled slowly, forcing herself to move, one step then another, counting silently as the stairwell seemed to contract around her, closing the gap between her and the unseen above. And in that oppressive quiet, with the dragging sound lingering, Gwen's words repeated in her mind. They won't find us. Not a promise, not a warning, a fact. And somewhere in that truth, Nicola understood that what came next would not be chosen. It would arrive, whether she was ready or not. Crawl under her skin. Every nerve in her body screamed in protest, yet she stayed rooted, unable to flee, as if the darkness itself had wrapped her in chains. The air felt thick, saturated with the smell that had haunted her from the start, sweet, decayed, impossible to pinpoint, clinging to her lungs like a warning. The footsteps shifted, deliberate, circling just above her, the faint scrape of nails or fabric dragging against concrete sending chills up her spine. Every exhale she forced was a betrayal, every heartbeat a signal to someone or something, waiting, calculating. Nicola's mind raced, trying to locate logic, to find a pattern, to convince herself this was some grotesque trick of the empty building. But instinct told her otherwise. A soft whisper, almost playful, slid through the darkness. Looking for me? The voice was familiar yet alien, intimate yet threatening, wrapping around her like smoke. Her throat constricted. Words she hadn't intended to speak tumbled out, trembling. Who are you? The laughter that followed was quiet, controlled, but carried a weight that pressed on her chest. Not what, the voice corrected, who. And in that single sharp distinction, Nicola's world narrowed. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a hunt. She was the prey. The warmth of the intruder's presence grew heavier, every inch of air vibrating with intent. She could feel the space constricting, could sense the anticipation threading through the dark. It was no longer about escape. It was about endurance, about understanding that someone or something was orchestrating every second, every movement, every reaction. Fear had become a tool, measured and precise, and she was already at its mercy. Nicola pressed herself closer to the wall, concrete biting through her coat, cold enough to numb the edges of her panic. Every sense sharpened, the faint creak of the next step, the uneven exhale of someone above, the subtle shift in temperature as the presence moved nearer. Her body was screaming to flee, to resist, but the truth was undeniable. She had entered a trap not of physical construction, but of psychological design. The darkness had a mind of its own, and it had singled her out. In the silence between breaths, the sweet, rotting scent deepened, seeping into her awareness, anchoring her in terror. Her mind grasped at fragments of reasoning, counting steps, tracing patterns, imagining lights flicking back on. But it was useless. She was no longer the observer. She was the observed. And the one who had orchestrated this hunt knew exactly how to make her understand it, slowly, fully, painfully. Nicola's hand slid along the wall, searching for something solid, anything to ground herself. But the truth settled in her chest. The stairwell had become a theater, and she was at the center. Every calculated step, every sound of dragging and breathing, every shadow coiling around her was deliberate. And when the figure finally revealed itself, she would know that nothing had been accidental, and that she was exactly where they had intended her to be. Felt small, insignificant in the grand scheme, unnoticed except by the one person who had been watching all along. Every routine, every quiet habit, every predictable choice had been cataloged, memorized, analyzed. Gwen had waited patiently, invisibly, blending into the background until the moment was perfect, until Nicola had stayed late, alone in an empty building, the stairwell the only route to escape. Now in the suffocating darkness, every detail of her life felt exposed. The way she walked, the rhythm of her breath, the slight tremor in her hands as adrenaline coursed through her veins, it was all known. Every calculated choice that had seemed mundane or safe had led her straight into this trap. And that smile, small, controlled, unchanging, no longer carried civility or friendliness. It was a mark of precision, of intent. Gwen wasn't just a colleague, she was a hunter. And Nicola, by her own patterns, had been chosen. The footsteps above them shifted again, deliberate, almost teasing. The dragging sound beneath it, like something heavy being pulled across the concrete, grew louder, pressing into Nicola's chest as if to remind her that the space she thought was safe, familiar, was now foreign, hostile. Her mind tried to cling to logic, to rationalize, to imagine there was still a way out. But the air itself seemed to conspire against her, thick with anticipation and that impossible clinging smell. She thought of all the small threads of her life, Gemma's quiet patience, David's detached comfort, the audits that would remain unfinished, the minor betrayals and overlooked details of office life. And she realized with a sinking weight that all of it, every mundane act, every unnoticed habit, had led her here. Gwen had studied it all, timed it all, and now she was fully in control. The darkness wasn't empty. It was curated, orchestrated, and Nicola was the centerpiece. Her fingers tightened around the handrail until the metal bit into her skin. The concrete pressed against her back, grounding her in a reality that was cold, unyielding, and frighteningly deliberate. She could feel the presence moving above, circling, calculating, weighing her every response. The air shifted with each step, the dragging sound marking each moment, a slow drumbeat of inevitability. Gwen's voice, when it came, was close enough to feel, yet distant in tone, flat, controlled, and precise. "You're exactly where you're supposed to be," it whispered. And in that instant, Nicola understood completely. This was no random encounter, no late-night anomaly. This was the culmination of 6 weeks of observation, planning, and patience. Every routine, every quirk, every detail of her solitary life had been a beacon. And now, trapped in darkness with the stairwell closing around her, she faced the consequence of being seen, truly seen, by someone who had never intended to let her go. Was interested in an insect crawling across a table, curious, detached, patient. Nicola froze, her fingers still gripping the cold steel of the handrail, every nerve screaming at her to move, to run, to do anything, but her body refused to obey. The emergency lights painted harsh shadows on the concrete walls, flickering slightly. highlighting the narrow stairwell and the space between predator and prey. Gwen's calm, deliberate presence below her made the scene even more surreal. Her posture was unnervingly controlled, her slight sway almost imperceptible, yet every movement seemed rehearsed, intentional. The stain on her cardigan, the loosened bun, the sharp alertness in her eyes, all of it conveyed that she had shed the mask of ordinary office life, revealing something far older, far colder beneath. And the man on the landing, he was the embodiment of quiet menace, not the grotesque or exaggerated villain of nightmares, but the type whose ordinariness made him more dangerous. The kind of person who could move through the world unnoticed, who could strike without warning, leaving no trace of malice until it was far too late. The canvas bag in his hand and the torch at rest suggested preparation, calculation, timing. Every detail screamed intent. Nicola's heart raced uncontrollably. Her mind spun, trying to catalog options, escape routes, any possible intervention, but all logic felt inadequate against the deliberate choreography of the two figures in the stairwell. Gwen's voice, still that same small, controlled tone, broke the silence, cutting through the tension like a knife. "You've noticed everything except yourself," she said. The words weren't accusatory. They were a statement, a truth stripped bare, and Nicola felt it pierce straight through her composure. It was the culmination of weeks of observation, of patient tracking, of waiting for the exact conditions to align. Every mundane detail of her life had been a signal, a beacon, leading her here. Above, the man shifted slightly, barely audible, yet enough to confirm he was poised, ready. Every instinct in Nicola screamed that time had stopped, that the universe had funneled down into this moment of perfect control. And yet, in that suspended breath between fear and inevitability, she felt a flicker, an infinitesimal possibility. One misstep by them, one moment of hesitation, and maybe, just maybe, she could turn the tables. But the red glow of the emergency lights cast long, unyielding shadows, and the realization hit her like ice water. She had been seen in ways she never imagined, tracked in ways she could never undo. And now, standing between the descent to the unknown below and the pair of predators waiting, Nicola understood that the office, the stairwell, her routines, all of it, had been weaponized against her. World outside the stairwell had stopped existing. Every rational thought about help, escape, or intervention felt impossibly distant, replaced by the raw, immediate terror of being trapped between two predators who had orchestrated this moment with painstaking precision. Nicola's hands pressed against the gray push bar, trying to force it open, but it refused to yield. The metal moved under her palms, teasing her with motion that led nowhere. Behind her, the heavy footsteps crawled closer, methodical and unhurried, dragging with each step like the echo of inevitability itself. Above her, Gwen's humming threaded through the stairwell, a quiet, monotonous chant that twisted the air, made the space feel alive, almost sentient, as if it were holding its breath alongside her. She looked up, heart hammering, and caught the man's shadow moving down from the dim red glow. His face remained ordinary, unreadable, but every movement radiated authority and control. Gwen trailed behind him like a shadow with a pulse, her hands folded, her head cocked, studying Nicola with an intensity that stripped away pretense, leaving only the raw calculation beneath. The two of them together were an inescapable force, a carefully timed predator and apprentice, each step bringing the inevitability of capture closer. Nicola's mind raced desperately, counting the seconds, the floors, the steps, but each calculation only underscored her helplessness. There was no handle, no lever, no relief at the bottom of this stairwell. The red emergency lights revealed only more concrete and more locked doors, corners where shadows pooled unnaturally, waiting to swallow her whole. Her body screamed to run, to push harder, to fight, but each movement only reminded her that she was alone, and the world beyond these walls was irrelevant. The dragging sound continued, relentless, deliberate. Gwen's tune shifted slightly, a soft, tuneless warble that made Nicola's stomach twist. Her instincts screamed at her to look for cracks, weaknesses, any escape, but the stairwell offered none. Every detail had been anticipated, every reaction predicted. The realization hit her fully. She had walked into this. Weeks of unnoticed observation, subtle smiles, fleeting conversations, all led to this inescapable moment. And yet, somewhere in the core of her panic, a small spark of survival flared. She drew her breath deeper, pressing her back harder against the door, listening, waiting, calculating. Because if these two had planned for everything, then perhaps, just perhaps, they hadn't accounted for the one thing that still belonged entirely to her: desperation. Any tiny opening that might save her, but there was nothing. No cracks, no weak hinges, no misaligned frame, just cold metal and unyielding concrete. The air in the stairwell was thick, almost tactile, carrying the faint metallic scent of sweat, the sharp tang of fear, and that lingering sweetness, rotten and cloying, from somewhere she couldn't pinpoint. The man knelt slowly beside the bag, unzipping it with deliberate care, and Gwen's eyes never left Nicola. The red emergency lights carved shadows into her face, highlighting the sharpness of her cheekbones, the hollow depth beneath her eyes. In that glow, she looked less like a human office temp, and more like an instrument finely tuned to a terrifying purpose. Nicola's voice barely rose above a whisper again. "Please, just don't." Her words trembled, but the plea was steady in her mind, the last thread of reason holding her to reality. Gwen's smile flickered, small, precise, almost satisfied. "You never thought to ask," she said, her tone casual, like she was pointing out a minor error in a spreadsheet rather than cornering someone in a stairwell. 17, the man said, his voice calm, almost polite, yet carrying an unmistakable weight. 17 this year. Different buildings, different floors, same pattern. We are thorough. His hands moved with slow, methodical precision, the way someone who had done this many times before treats even the smallest detail as critical. Gwen added her words smooth, rehearsed, yet carrying an almost predatory warmth. "I pick carefully. Someone who stays late, someone who won't be missed, someone predictable enough to fall right into the plan. You were perfect." Nicola pressed harder against the cold steel behind her, every muscle taut, searching frantically for a weakness, a moment, anything that might tip the balance. But there was only the sound of her own heart, hammering in her chest, and the quiet, deadly rhythm of two people who had calculated everything, who had rehearsed her panic, who had orchestrated this night down to the last flicker of red light. Her mind screamed, her body ached, but somewhere deep inside, a spark of clarity emerged. They had planned for everything except the unpredictable, except the raw, desperate will to survive. And just that might still be her weapon. Instant, she clung to it like a lifeline, a final moment of control before the inevitability pressed down. The man straightened, bag in hand, moving with deliberate slowness, savoring the anticipation. Gwen's figure was a dark sentinel behind him, her posture rigid, her smile taut and knowing, like she had rehearsed this exact moment hundreds of times in her mind. Nicola's pulse raced, every nerve firing. She thought of her daughter's laugh, sharp and bright, echoing in her memory like a fragile beacon. She thought of the unfinished mundane, emails, audits, the small routines that filled a life with invisible threads of significance. And she realized in a flash, that those threads were the only things anchoring her to the world outside this red-lit tomb. The wet sound came again as the man shifted his bag, and Gwen hummed that low monotone tune, so casual yet so chilling in its precision. Nicola's mind spun, searching, grasping for any solution, any slip, any human error in the execution of this horrifyingly practiced plan. Her body pressed to the wall, teeth clenched, lungs straining with breath she barely controlled, her thoughts sharp and desperate. Then a fragment of strategy emerged. They relied on her fear, on her paralysis, on the perfect predictability of her movements. What if she broke the script? What if she acted unpredictably, refused the careful path they'd mapped for her? The idea was small, fragile, yet it sparked something she hadn't felt in minutes: agency. Her eyes opened. The red emergency lights didn't blind her anymore. They painted the walls, the steps, Gwen, the man, and herself in stark relief. She was no longer invisible, no longer a figure to be studied and cataloged. She was present, real, and dangerously aware. And then she moved, not running, not panicking, but moving with intention, with a decision that could alter the pattern they'd relied upon for weeks. A choice that screamed without sound that the observer had become the observed, and that the night's carefully orchestrated symphony might just hit a note of chaos. She had never noticed the most important thing: the quiet truth that danger doesn't always arrive with a scream. Sometimes it slips into your life gently, politely, wearing a borrowed smile and holding a mug of tea. And now, as the humming thickened the air, as the man prepared whatever waited inside that bag, as the stairwell's red glow pulsed like a dying heartbeat, Nicola finally saw, too late, that evil rarely looked like a monster. It looked like someone who blended in so perfectly that no alarm ever rose in your chest. A soft breath escaped her. Not a sob, not a plea, just resignation, an exhale shaped by a lifetime of quiet compromises and unnoticed wounds. Then something shifted. A sound almost nothing threaded through Gwen's humming. A faint metallic vibration. A tremor. Nicola's eyes snapped open. One of the emergency lights flickered again. But this time it didn't hold. It sputtered dim, then cut out completely, plunging the stairwell into a deeper darkness, a living darkness that swallowed the red glow like ink. Gwen's humming stopped mid-note. The man froze. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a new sound rose from the darkness above them. Not footsteps, not a voice, but the unmistakable hiss of the magnetic lock disengaging somewhere on a higher floor. A door unlocking. Someone had noticed. Someone was coming. Not fast, not heroically, but coming. Gwen inhaled sharply. The first real sign of panic Nicola had ever heard from her. The man muttered, "We're not alone." His calm cracked like thin ice. Something had gone wrong. Something they had not planned for. In that instant, Nicola felt the tiniest spark kindle inside her chest. Not hope, not yet, but the ghost of it, the outline of its shape. And for the first time since the lights failed, since the staircase turned into a red-lit tomb, Nicola felt something return to her limbs, a thread of strength, thin as paper, but hers. The darkness was complete now. But in that darkness, the script Gwen and the man had written for her was breaking, fracturing, and Nicola, trembling, breath-shaking, finally understood. Being unnoticed had always been her curse. But right now, in this moment, it might become her salvation. She never realized that some people weren't people at all. They were hollow shells, silhouettes shaped like humans, moving through life with nothing inside. No empathy, no conscience, no spark of recognition. They dressed right, spoke right, smiled just enough to pass unnoticed. But behind the small, perfect smiles were voids filled only with patience, calculation, and hunger. The kind that measured every opportunity and waited for the perfect moment to strike. Nicola considered opening her eyes, meeting whatever awaited her with courage, with the calm, rational resolve she always relied on. But she didn't. She stayed in the darkness, eyelids shut tight, bracing for the inevitable. The humming stopped. Silence descended like a living thing, thick and oppressive. Then Gwen's voice cut through it, soft, almost gentle, carrying a cold amusement beneath the surface. "Everyone assumes," she said. "Everyone sees what they expect. That's what makes it easy. That's what makes it work." The red emergency lights flickered once, twice, and died. Absolute darkness swallowed the stairwell. In that darkness, Nicola understood the truth she should have seen weeks ago. The real monsters don't roar. They sit beside you, smile by the kettle, make idle conversation at the hot desk, and wait. Wait until you stay late. Wait until you let your guard down. Wait for a single moment that's long enough for them to act. They're always there, and they're never really there at all. Monday morning, the cleaners found her bag wedged between the wall and the handrail on the fourth-floor landing. Its contents scattered: lipstick, tissues, a hairbrush, receipts from the supermarket. Her phone, her keys, her employee pass gone. Nicola herself never found. Security reviewed the footage. She left her desk at 7:60, walked toward the lifts, paused, glanced back, and then nothing. The emergency stairwell was a blind spot, a gap in the surveillance. In retrospect, it seemed obvious, but no one thought to address it. After all, emergency stairs were for emergencies, and no one ever used them otherwise. And that was the lesson Nicola would never escape. The monsters you don't see are the ones that claim you, silently, patiently, perfectly. The investigation dragged on for 6 tense weeks. Police questioned everyone who had been on the 8th floor that evening, but that meant only one person: Nicola. The cleaners recalled glimpses of her, fleeting and uncertain, unable to place exact times or locations. Security logs were incomplete. Their system had been glitching, and sometimes people slipped through unrecorded. Jeremy Ashton mentioned her stress over the audit. Her ex-husband remarked on her stubbornness during the divorce. Her daughter said her mother had always seemed distant, searching for something unnamed, and maybe she had finally decided to look elsewhere. No one mentioned Gwen. Investigators asked about recent hires, temps, or any unusual staff, but no one could remember anyone like her. The hot desk station had been used by many over the months, but it had gone unnoticed. Security had no record of a Gwen Pritchard. HR had no file. Payroll had no entry. As far as anyone could tell, Gwen had never existed. She had been a ghost threaded through the fabric of perception, an anomaly the human brain simply ignored because it didn't fit the expected pattern. And now she was gone too, leaving only questions with no answers and a lingering unease that settled over the 8th floor, unshakable and cold. The hot desk station remained empty. No one dared sit there. They couldn't explain why, it just felt wrong. Even on warm days, the area carried a chill, a subtle tension, as if unseen eyes tracked every move. Something patient, calculating, waiting for someone to make a mistake, waiting for someone to stay late, waiting for someone to be alone. The emergency stairwell, meanwhile, was sealed for investigation, but it became a source of quiet dread. The electronic lock failed again and again, 3 times in the first month, twice more after that. Engineers tested the mechanism and found it flawless, yet during normal use it failed unpredictably. The door was always cold, not merely cool, but impossibly, unnaturally cold, radiating a frigid pocket that seemed detached from the building's heating system. A thermometer placed against it once read 15 degrees C, while the corridor measured 22 degrees C. No draft, no explanation, just cold. Maintenance eventually gave up. The door remained sealed. The lock remained faulty. The chill persisted. After that, the 8th floor grew quiet. Everyone left on time. No one stayed late. Cleaners moved swiftly, finishing their work by 6:30, leaving the building to shadows and silence. And somewhere else, in some other building in London, a woman in a gray cardigan waited, sitting at a hot desk station, making small talk by the kettle, smiling that small, tight smile, watching, always watching, waiting for someone who stayed late, someone who would not be missed immediately, someone who would, when the time came, take the stairs.